Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brian Sugrim? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Besham Brian Sugrim was born on February 24, 1976, in Guyana. He went by the name Brian. At some point, he moved to the state of New York. As far as his immigration status, one could say that he was documentation challenged. Sometime around 1994, 18-year-old Brian met a 16-year-old named Bernadette. The couple became romantically involved. Bernadette never had any romantic contact before and was flattered by the attention she received from Brian. In 1995, Brian allegedly attacked Bernadette's brothers after some type of disagreement. He fled to Canada to avoid arrest. While he was there, he wrote love letters to Bernadette. Eventually, Brian returned to New York and was arrested. He only received probation and continued his romantic relationship with Bernadette. On March 1, 1996, a 60-year-old man named Demetrius Carter was found dead in the basement of a residence owned by Brian's parents. No one was ever charged in connection with his death, but Brian was the prime suspect. A few days later, Brian told Bernadette that he killed a man. Presumably, he was referring to Demetrius. Brian asked Bernadette if she could forgive him. Bernadette said that part of her was in disbelief and she needed to be Brian's savior. The romantic relationship continued even after the confession. On June 22, 1997, 21-year-old Brian and 19-year-old Bernadette married. They lived in an apartment in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. According to Bernadette, things were good for about 2 months, but then Brian started mistreating her verbally and emotionally. This eventually escalated into the realm of the physical. Concerned that he might be cheating on her, Bernadette moved to Florida with a friend in 1999. Brian followed her there to reconcile. Bernadette became pregnant in 2000. They returned to New York and had a daughter. Later, the couple also had a son. After moving from New York to Michigan, Brian allegedly perpetrated an insurance scam by setting a fire in a house in Battle Creek. No charges were ever filed. The family moved to Kalamazoo. In 2001, Brian's brother was killed in a motorcycle collision. Due to Brian's immigration challenges, he took his brother's identity. According to Bernadette, Brian continued to mistreat her over the course of the next several years. He would frequently break household items, scream and yell, use offensive names, and lecture Bernadette for selecting the wrong words. Brian demanded that Bernadette answer the phone right away when he called, keep the house clean, and follow his instructions perfectly. Bernadette tried to appease Brian to avoid making him angry. She and her children had to walk on eggshells, and the home was filled with anxiety and tension. After an episode of mistreatment, Brian would apologize and beg for forgiveness. On one occasion, he allegedly threatened Bernadette with a shotgun, but she remained in the marriage. Throughout this time, Brian had trouble keeping a job. Bernadette is the one who kept the family afloat financially. On September 14, 2003, the body of a 39-year-old sex worker named Linda K. Gibson was found in an industrial area about a mile away from where Brian and his family lived. Brian told Bernadette that he had murdered a woman. Presumably, he was referring to Linda. He wanted Bernadette to monitor the news as he prepared his escape. On September 16, Brian reported his van missing. Bernadette never saw the vehicle again. Brian then traveled to New York and stayed with relatives. They were not expecting him. He was gone for about 6 to 8 weeks. After his return, life went back to normal. Brian was not arrested for Linda's murder. In 2005, Brian sent Bernadette to the sheriff's office to pick up a license to purchase a handgun. When Bernadette was there, she saw a photograph of Linda. Bernadette would later say, quote, "I had to stand there and get my license while staring at that, knowing I am buying a gun for the same person who took that life. I wanted to scream out, I know who did it, but I knew I couldn't, It was awful, unquote. In October 2009, Bernadette had a heart attack and barely survived. The stress of her relationship with Brian may have contributed to this incident. Sometime around 2011, as Bernadette was becoming increasingly concerned for her safety, she wrote a letter that was to be opened in the event of her death. It contained accusations against Brian. For example, he threatened Bernadette's life, he was a killer, he was a danger to their children, and he had used a fake identity. Bernadette sealed the envelope and gave it to a friend. In addition, she started sleeping with a loaded handgun under her pillow. On May 16, 2011, Brian and his family were participating in a martial arts training session in the garage, which he allegedly forced them to do every Monday. During the session, Brian repeatedly struck his daughter Sky with a martial arts baton. He hit her a total of 50 times. Sky ran to a neighbor's residence and asked for the police to be called. They arrested Brian for attacking her, and he eventually pleaded no contest. But this was not Brian's only problem. Bernadette told the police that Brian had confessed to killing Linda Gibson. Brian was charged with first-degree murder and went to trial. On February 15, 2012, he was found guilty and was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now moving to my analysis. Brian Sugrim maintains his innocence, and he has a few supporters. They argue that there is not enough evidence connecting him to the murder of Linda Gibson. Furthermore, if Brian really confessed to Bernadette in 2003, when Linda was murdered, why did Bernadette wait until 2011 to tell the police? The state, of course, disagrees. They believe the case against Brian was strong. This brings me to the question, was Brian guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence, both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Brian allegedly confessed to Bernadette that he killed Linda. He also allegedly confessed in 1996 to another murder. A sex worker named Grande testified that Brian picked up her and Linda on September 14, 2003, and drove them to a secluded area in his van. Brian and Linda engaged in a physical altercation. As Grande was running away, she saw Brian on top of Linda. Brian admitted that he was in his van with Linda on the night she died, although he claimed another man was also there. Witnesses saw a van matching the description of Brian's van near the area where Linda's body was found. A neighbor saw what appeared to be blood on the inside of Brian's van, and Brian was cleaning the van with bleach. Brian made his van disappear right after the murder. Bernadette and another witness noticed scratches on Brian's chest. Brian unexpectedly stopped by the home of relatives in another state and stayed there for 6 to 8 weeks. According to Bernadette, Brian had mistreated her and their children over the course of years. He attacked his daughter with a baton, which indicates he is capable of being violent. On one occasion, Brian allegedly shot the family dog to death. Moving to the exculpatory factors, no physical evidence tied Brian to the murder. The sex worker Grande admitted that she lied to the police multiple times about Linda Gibson's case. Bernadette's testimony about Brian's confession was critical to the state's case, but why did it take her so long to come forward? Why did she remain with Brian after he confessed to the second murder? Or for that matter, after the first murder? Bernadette could have easily escaped from Brian. It wasn't a question of being trapped. She had taken several vacations by herself and had left Brian several times during the relationship. Is it possible that Bernadette implicated Brian simply because she was done with the marriage? Maybe he never confessed to the murder. When considering all the evidence, do I believe that Brian was guilty of murder? Yes, I believe he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. During the early stages of the romantic relationship between Brian and Bernadette, Brian was charismatic and attentive. Bernadette believed that Brian loved her, and she felt special based on the way he treated her. This was like a drug. Bernadette stated, quote, "He was the first person to show me affection or love. He was my first kiss, sexual encounter, my first everything. He told me how much he needed me and loved me," unquote. When Brian started mistreating Bernadette, she was alarmed, but not willing to give up on the dream. She thought to herself that Brian would not kill her because he loved her too much. Brian was able to convince Bernadette to stay by asking for forgiveness. he was highly manipulative. Every time Brian indicated a shortcoming, including confessing to a murder, Bernadette took it as a challenge to fix him. She said, quote, "For the first 10 years of our marriage, I felt I was put into his life. It was my responsibility to make him a better person. I thought my love would be enough to break that. It bothered me for a long time that I wasn't able to do anything for him or change him," unquote. Bernadette was bothered by the 2 murder confessions, but she said, quote, "I learned not to let it eat away at me. I put it out of my mind. I couldn't survive if I thought about it all the time," unquote. Bernadette tolerated mistreatment at the hands of Brian for years without saying anything, but this changed after Brian attacked their daughter, Sky. When Sky ran to a neighbor and asked for the police to be called, Bernadette was no longer willing to remain silent. Bernadette's testimony was critical to the state obtaining a conviction. She had been holding the key to putting Brian in prison the entire time. Moving to the next question, some people are astonished by Bernadette's behavior. They find her decision to keep Brian's secret for so many years to be incomprehensible. Was her behavior reasonable or understandable? I think if Bernadette had kept a secret about a non-homicidal crime that Brian committed, that would be a lot different. Like if Brian had told her a story about stealing money or using drugs, one could appreciate how Bernadette would keep that information a secret and not necessarily be overly concerned. The problem is, that's not what happened. According to Bernadette, Brian confessed to 2 murders. One would think that a murder confession would be a relationship deal breaker. With the first alleged murder, that of Demetrius Carter, maybe Bernadette really didn't believe Brian. The relationship did not feature violence at this point. Perhaps Bernadette thought that Brian was speaking figuratively, like he had inappropriate guilt due to something like depression. Brian was accepting responsibility for something he didn't do. Even if one wanted to give Bernadette the benefit of the doubt after Brian made the first confession, her behavior after the second confession is nothing short of perplexing. When Brian confessed to killing the sex worker in 2003, there was plenty of evidence that the murder happened and that Brian was responsible. This wasn't inappropriate guilt or dramatic behavior. Brian was confessing because he did it. Any reasonable person would have known that Brian was guilty. Bernadette did not have any excuse for failing to notify law enforcement. No amount of romance, attention, affection, or a desire to fix a lover can explain that failure. Brian was confident that he had total control over Bernadette because, essentially, he did. It wasn't Bernadette's courage that led to Brian's undoing. Rather, it was the courage of his daughter. Now moving to my final thoughts. If Brian's 2 confessions were insufficient to convince Bernadette to call the police, what would have been enough? What if he had confessed to a 3rd murder, a 4th murder? Where would Bernadette have drawn the line? There is the sense that she would have responded by saying something like, "There goes Brian again with another murder." This case may be about Bernadette's refusal to believe something that was true, but it also represents an extreme case of a married couple maintaining separate lives. Like if Brian wanted to commit murder, that was fine because it was his business. This case illustrates how the power that a potentially narcissistic and psychopathic offender has in a romantic relationship can be augmented by his partner's gullibility and refusal to acknowledge the truth. Even when someone really believes in the quality and permanence of their marriage, certain behaviors must represent deal breakers. Murder is one of those behaviors. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brian Sugrim. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.